Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. The first item of business today is general questions. Our first question from Fulton MacGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it supports care-experienced young people into higher and further education.
Minister Richard Lockhead.
The Scottish Government provided additional investment of over £5 million in 2018-19 and 2019-20 to increase the care experience bursary across further education and higher education to £8,100 per year. This additional investment funding increased from the previous level of £7,625 in HE and £4,185 in FE, providing a significant increase in the financial support available to care experienced students. We are, of course, continuing to work on improvements and focus additional support funding on those students who are most in need.
Fulton MacGregor.
I thank the Minister for that response, and the Minister might be aware that I recently wrote to SAS on behalf of a constituent who has been told that she doesn't qualify for a care experience bursary because her period in care was not in the UK. I suspect that this is an anomaly in the system and will affect only a small number of students. Would the Minister commit to looking into this matter further so that to ensure that all care experienced children have the same and equal rights regardless of where in the world they experience being in the care of the state?
Minister.
Well, thank you for the question. I will certainly undertake to look into the circumstances outlined by Fulton MacGregor. I'm sure he'll appreciate that there may well be anomalies in the system and they should be investigated and sorted if necessary. But clearly we do have to lay down some kind of criteria as to who qualifies for student support in Scotland. But I do agree with the premise of the member's question, and I do hope he gets a satisfactory reply, but I certainly will investigate the circumstances.
Question number 2, Liam McArthur.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what guidance it provides for college students regarding fees encountered for starting a course and then withdrawing.
Minister Richard Lockhead.
The majority of colleges do not apply a fee to full-time students at higher education level who withdraw early from their course. As colleges operate independently of government. It is ultimately the decision of individual colleges as to whether they apply charges to students who withdraw early and before the fee cut-off date of the 1st of December. Students are advised by the Student Awards Agency Scotland that they could be charged a fee by their institution should they withdraw before the fee cut-off date. However, I expect institutions to take into account the personal circumstances of individual students when applying any fees.
McArthur.
I thank the Minister for that helpful response. I was contacted by a constituent forced to drop out of an HNC course after a deterioration in her mental health. On returning to Orkney, my constituent's mother then passed away suddenly, adding further distress to an already anxious and difficult time. Almost simultaneously and without warning, my constituent was informed by the college that she would face a charge of over £400 and even the threat of court action. I'm in touch with the college principal, who helpfully has agreed to look into the matter. But does the Minister believe clearer guidance could be provided to colleges about using discretion over levying charges in such circumstances? And does the Minister accept that this reflects the duty of care colleges owe their students, including those who have left with no option but to drop out early?
Minister.
Well, firstly, I'm very sorry to hear about Mr McArthur's constituents' personal circumstances, and I absolutely understand why he's raising this case. I would expect colleges to understand the reasons as to why any student may be withdrawing from a course early, and it's very important they therefore take any decision about asking for fees to be paid within the context of the circumstances that's led to that withdrawal. So I shall certainly ask my officials to look into the case highlighted by Mr McArthur, but I am pleased to hear that Mr Paul Little, the principal of City of Glasgow College, is looking into this matter, and hopefully he'll give a satisfactory response.
Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister clarify if Scottish Government statistics on positive destinations take into account those young people who start a college course and then withdraw after a short period of time?
Minister.
Well, there's a range of different circumstances that are taken into account with the statistics, so I don't think there's a simple answer to the question because there's different cut-off dates and different ways in which they're calculated. But I will certainly drop a note to the member just to elaborate on that point.
Question number 3, Peter Chapman.
To ask the Scottish Government what percentage of children in the NHS Grampian area who have mental health issues are being seen within the 18-week referral to treatment target.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
In the latest quarter for which statistics are available, which is January to March this year, 43.3% of children and young people were referred to the Grampian CAMS were seen within 18 weeks.
Peter Chapman.
I thank the Minister for that answer, although I am very disappointed with it. As he rightly says, in the first 3 months of this year, only 43% of young patients were seen within 18 weeks. NHS Grampian have said they have some of the longest waiting times. It is the lowest staffed board and it is also the lowest funded health board in Scotland. The consistency of missed targets at NHS Grampian show that there is a real problem. Can the Minister stop with the excuses, accept this is unacceptable and tell me how the Scottish Government plans to address this?
Minister.
So I think the Minister for Mental Health has been absolutely clear that this is unacceptable. That's why we have taken a range of measures to help support health boards reach the standard that 90% of patients are seen within 18-week referral. And the Scottish Government is currently working with health boards, including Grampian, to agree their annual operation plans, including how they will deliver on the standard. To help boards and integration joint boards achieve this ambition, we've outlined a package of measures to do more to support positive mental health and prevent ill health, which includes £250 million of additional investment. That comes in addition to the £54 million which has already been invested to help boards improve their performance against waiting time targets by investing in workforce development, recruitment and retention and service improvement support. Our investment has allowed the CAMS workforce to increase by 75%, with the number of CAMS psychologists more than doubling under this government.
Thank you. Question number 4, Gil Paterson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it helps families to meet the cost of child starting school.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, we've delivered a wide range of initiatives to help families meet the costs associated with starting school, including the Pupil Equity Fund and improvements to both free school meals and the school clothing grant. Our Best Start grant has already provided more than £3.5 million to families on low incomes at key stages in their children's early years. Since the 3rd of June, it has also provided a £250 school-age payment when a child is due to start primary school. It can be used for anything from school clubs, travel costs, days out or clothing.
Gil Paterson.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? Cabinet Secretary, I've raised this with you before, and you will see a motion in my name in a similar vein on universal credit awareness. Can the Scottish Government say what they are doing to promote and inform the public on the new Best Start payment? We really need to make sure those that need the support know exactly where they can get it.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Mr Paterson makes a serious point, and he's made this point to me a number of times before on the awareness of measures of this type to try to support families. A coordinated communications plan is being implemented, working with local authorities, health boards and third sector organisations who support applicants. We've also provided, as we did for the launch of the previous Best Start grant payments, a range of guidance, promotional materials and media content for stakeholders, and we hope that that will explain eligibility criteria and encourage applications.
Thank you. Question number 5, Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it's ensuring that there is a skills base to deliver the transformational change required to address the climate emergency.
Minister Jamie Hepburn.
We have established the Just Transition Commission, which is expertise in the labour market and skills to advise ministers on the move to a net zero economy. The Commission's work plan has identified skills as a key topic. Analysis of current and future labour requirements, including skills, will form an ongoing part of its considerations.
Gillian Martin.
Thank the Minister for that answer. The Just Transition Commission will be key to ensuring that Scotland's transition from burning fossil fuels to a low-carbon economy is one in which our citizens will not be disadvantaged in terms of employment and will have the opportunities to gain the skills for the future. Can I ask if the Just Transition Commission will include representatives from Scotland's colleges and universities as this work continues, and what roles Skills Development Scotland will play in ensuring our workforce is ready for the transition?
Minister.
Commission membership was laid out in December of last year. There are representatives of academia on there, Professor Jim Skeys, the chair, and we also have Professor Karen Turner from Strathclyde University, so there are representatives of academia. Skills Development Scotland, of course, are our national skills agency. They undertake skills planning on across all sectors, across all areas of the country, which supports an assessment of current and future skills needs. They are the Government's skills agency, and when we set out our ambitions, we expect them to respond, and this area is no different.
Jamie Halcroft-Johnson.
It's now been 2 years since the Scottish Conservatives first called for the establishment of a circular economy, education and skills academy, a move that could boost skills base across to tackle climate breakdown. Now that the First Minister has declared a climate emergency, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that such an academy should be established as a priority?
Minister.
We will give consideration to all reasonable propositions made in good faith, but I would observe we have a well-established skills system already. We invest considerable amounts in it already. We expect that skills system to be responsive to our needs, including in this area. We will shortly be publishing our National Skills Action Plan, which will set out how we intend to make sure we have an ever more responsive skills system to all the requirements. But yes, I will always be willing to consider any proposition, but candidly right now we have a skills system in place and I expect it to be responding to the task at hand.
Question number 5, Ruth McGuire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it's made of the potential impact on glass recycling rates of including glass containers in its planned deposit return scheme.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
As outlined through our Stage 1 full business case published on 8th May, we anticipate that a DRS will increase glass bottle recycling rates from the existing 64% towards 90%. As bottles make up the bulk of glass packaging used for food and drink, this will drive up the overall glass recycling rate. The Scottish Government remains committed to supporting local authority collection arrangements for a range of packaging materials alongside DRS. Under our proposed reforms of wider packaging producer responsibility arrangements, the costs to local authorities of delivering these services will in future be met by producers.
Ruth McGuire.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Ardagh Glass is an important employer in my constituency. They've raised concerns with me that in other countries an unintended consequence of including glass in deposits was that manufacturers switched to plastics. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide reassurance that the matter of glass is being considered carefully, with both industry and consumers being consulted? And will she join me on a visit to Ardagh Glass in Irvine to see first-hand the contribution that they make to recycling?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I am committed to working closely with industry as we progress with the implementation of our proposals. And in fact, I'm already meeting Ardagh Glass on 26 June to discuss our plans in more detail. I do recognise the concerns around the inclusion of glass. However, I believe these factors are more than offset by the significant increase in glass recycling and the reduction in carbon emissions that this will deliver. There's also the potential for the glass industry to directly benefit from the higher quality recyclable glass, which we expect to capture through DRS.
And Maurice Golden.
Refer members to my register of interests. The inclusion of glass in a deposit return scheme is a risk to local authorities and key sectors such as the Scotch whisky. For example, over £3 million of funding has been withdrawn from Aberdeenshire Council for their new waste collection system, and industry have warned about the viability of the supply chain. Will the Cabinet Secretary pledge to ensure that no council job losses are resulting from the scheme, and also that all resources collected via the scheme are recycled here in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I had understood that the Conservatives supported the inclusion of glass within the scheme, and I just hope that by the tone of Maurice Golden's question, they're not beginning to renege on that support. Special advisers and officials have recently met with other glass industry interests, so we are aware of the concerns, and I think I made that very clear when I made my statement, that we understand some of the issues that are around the inclusion of glass. However, I made it clear in my earlier answer to Ruth Maguire that the issues that are connected to local authority recycling aren't just as straightforward as perhaps are being suggested by Maurice Golden. And we will, of course, continue to keep all of the issues related to that under consideration. That is what the Implementation Advisory Group is for.
Question number 7, Edward Mountain.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government on what date it was first made aware of bullying in NHS Highland and what action it took.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
As the member will know from the response he received to this same question on the 23rd of May, a search of all records available from the 1st of January 2011 shows that the earliest correspondence on file relating to NHS Highland, which mentioned the term bullying, was received on the 16th of March 2014. This was correspondence addressed to a trade union and copied to the Scottish Government for information only. The Scottish Government have proactively engaged with the individual concerned and continue to engage to this day.
Edward Mountain.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I understand that the Board of NHS Highland knew of serious bullying allegations in 2010. And as you have pointed out, the Scottish Government knew about bullying in March 2014. If the issue had been dealt with properly then, it wouldn't be the crisis it is today. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree it was a serious failure by the Government that has allowed the situation to develop as it has?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I do not agree, and despite Mr Mountain's best efforts, I think that we have handled this situation very well since the commissioning of the Sturrock report, which was prompted by allegations of a culture of bullying. Not individual cases, a culture of bullying. I think we handled that swiftly, we handled it well. It was an independent report which has been well received, I'm sure to Mr Mountain's chagrin, by staff and others in NHS Highland, and on which we continue to act. And indeed, a week today, I will visit NHS Highland myself to understand exactly how they're progressing their action plan, and I think it behoves members, particularly those who claim to represent those in the Highlands, to get behind this report and give it their absolute support.
And David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Has the Cabinet Secretary considered the Francis Review, which looked into bullying within the NHS in England? Its recommendations included early support of whistleblowers, cultural change and prevention of isolation and containment. Will the Cabinet Secretary incorporate these recommendations into NHS Highland and beyond?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Stewart for that supplementary question. As he knows from the statement I made on the publication of the Sturrock Review, I made clear that I understood well that some of what was in that report applied across as lessons across our NHS, and that is why one of the actions that I've taken is to bring together a leadership group from across our regulation bodies, our Royal Colleges, our staff and trade union representatives and our boards to meet with me over the summer to look at what more we need to do across our NHS to ensure we have a positive working culture. And that, of course, responds in many ways to the recommendations of the Francis Review.
And question number 8, Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what progress is being made in developing coach park facilities at the Yarlsoft site in Shetland.
Minister Ben McPherson.
Presiding Officer, as Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop explained in a letter to Tavish Scott on the 2nd of May, discussions remain ongoing regarding the proposed improvements to visitor facilities at Jarlshof. Legitimate questions have been raised regarding best value for money for the public and taxpayers, and ministers await further advice that this position has been addressed. The Cabinet Secretary has asked Historic Environment Scotland to ensure that matters are expedited insofar as is within their control.
Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Sunborough Hotel, local bus businesses and the cruise line industry have been told for 3 years that Historic Environment Scotland and the agencies and the government would sort out these coach park facilities. But all we've had is endless buck passing. Why?
Minister.
For clarity, Presiding Officer, Historic Environment Scotland are aware of the vital need, as has been expressed, for facilities at Jarlshof, and the need, the current provision for these facilities is not sustainable. Plus, Historic Environment Scotland have been considering their options and have been keeping ministers informed with developments. But as I'm sure Tavish Scott is aware, there are legal sensitivities around current negotiations which relate to the proposals to improve parking and visitor facilities. As such, it would be inappropriate for me to go into any detail on those ongoing discussions at this time. What's more, as would always be the case in any process of this nature, it is the responsibility of ministers to ensure that best value for money can be evidenced. But, Presiding Officer, I will ensure that Historic Environment Scotland are asked to make contact with the member to further discuss these matters and to inform Tavish Scott of any updates as appropriate.
Thank you very much. Apologies to Jenny Gilruth and Bill Kidd. Time is up on general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, the Education Secretary took issue with us raising questions about Scottish education in the Chamber, so I'd like to return to the matter. Mr Swinney claimed recently that there has been no narrowing of subject choice for senior pupils in Scotland. Indeed, he said choice is blossoming and that the options available to young people are colossal. So can I ask the First Minister where the evidence is for that?
First Minister.
Well, perhaps I could quote her own education spokesperson, Liz Smith, who a couple of weeks ago at the relevant committee said there is more choice for young people. So there is some evidence, but I think the best evidence of how our education system is performing are the results that our young people are achieving, whether we look at level 5 qualifications, level 6 qualifications, the numbers of young people getting more than 5 hires, whether we look at the narrowing of the attainment gap, we find improvement in all of these measures. And that takes me to, I think, the flaw in Ruth Davidson's argument. She wants to tell people that there's something terribly wrong in our education system. Unfortunately, the pupils of Scotland are proving her wrong by doing better each and every year.
Ruth Davidson.
The First Minister talks about the number of qualifications gained, but what she doesn't say is that the number of A to C grades has actually dropped on her watch by 3%. But we've asked for the evidence on subject choice, and here's what we've found. We got results from every school in Scotland setting out the average number of qualifications taken by pupils in S4 over the last few years. Not just Nat 4 and 5, but every single qualification taken. In 2013, when Curriculum for Excellence was introduced, there were 308 secondary schools where pupils took an average of 7 or more qualifications at S4. By 2018, that figure had fallen to just 182, a drop of more than 40%. And by contrast, the number of schools where pupils took 6 subjects or fewer has gone up from just 46 in 2013 to 165. So to go back to the Education Secretary's comments, does that sound like blossoming choice to the First Minister?
First Minister.
As we have discussed many times in this chamber, it is not simply a matter of the qualifications that young people take in S4. What matters are the qualifications young people leave school with, the qualifications they take over the entirety of the senior phase of education. Let me quote the head of education at Aberdeenshire Council, Tory-led Aberdeenshire Council. Young people mature at different rates, and having qualifications available to them over a 3-year period gives much greater flexibility and allows them to learn at a stage when they are ready. It's the entirety of the senior phase that matters. And the facts are these. At level 5, we see the percentage of pupils getting qualifications increasing. At level 6, we see it increasing. In 2009, 22% of young people left school with 5 hires or more. That is now more than 30% of pupils, and we're seeing the attainment gap narrow. So again, I come back to this fundamental point. The evidence does not bear out Ruth Davidson's analysis. The evidence is of an education system that is improving and young people that are doing better.
Ruth Davidson.
To be fair, Presiding Officer, I wasn't expecting a completely impartial answer from the First Minister. So in anticipation, we decided instead to seek one out this morning. And we put all of this to Professor Jim Scott, the former head teacher, who's probably spent more time than anyone examining changes of subject choice in Scotland. And he says that this data confirms that since the introduction of Curriculum for Excellence, just over 200 schools have declines or significant declines in the number of entries for SQA qualifications, whereas just over 50 demonstrate an increase. Does the First Minister accept that, or is that all part of some great Moanfest conspiracy too?
First Minister.
Again, much of the analysis that Professor Scott has done has looked at qualifications at S4, and the fundamental point we are making here is that while of course that is important, is the qualifications young people leave school with. And we are seeing more people, young people leave school with more qualifications. We're seeing the gap between the richest and the poorest narrow. We're seeing a report from our Commissioner for Fair Access just this week saying that we're making significant progress in narrowing the attainment gap in terms of young people going on into university. And of course, we've got a record number of young people going into positive destinations overall. So we will continue to work hard to make this progress in education, but no matter how much Ruth Davidson wants to talk down the performance of Scottish education, the facts, quite frankly, are proving her wrong.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, if we're going to improve education in this country, we need to accept information and evidence, whether that's on combined classes or on subject choice being restricted. And the First Minister and the Education Secretary need to listen. Because this isn't just down to schools exercising choice, it's schools not having enough teachers or support to provide full choice. And it's children from disadvantaged areas suffering the most because they are still the ones most likely to leave school at the end of S4. The Parliament is already conducting an inquiry into this matter, so can I ask the First Minister, will she and her Education Secretary spend a bit less time attacking the messengers and a bit more time listening to the evidence that they come forward with?
First Minister.
Well, we'll continue to spend time looking at the evidence. So Ruth Davidson never quite manages to respond to the actual evidence. So let me set it out for her again. When this government took office, just over 70% of young people left school with a level 5 qualification. That's now 86%. At level 6, when we took office, it was just over 41%. Now it's 62%. 22% in 2009 leaving school with 5 hires or more, now over 30%. And we see the gap in attainment narrowing. These are the facts. Ruth Davidson doesn't like them because they don't suit her. Now let's go on to
teacher numbers. There are more teachers in our schools now than at any time since 2010. There are more primary school teachers in our schools than at any time since I was at primary school. And I have to say, Ruth Davidson's got a bit of a cheek talking about numbers of teachers in our schools when she's the leader of the austerity party in Scotland. And the leader of the party that would give tax cuts to the richest and therefore take money out of our education system. So we'll get on with the job of improving education, and we'll leave Ruth Davidson to defend whatever latest Tory ends up imposing austerity on Scotland.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
This week, our pensioners faced a direct attack on their living standards when the BBC announced it plans to scrap universal free TV licences to the over 75s. The Scottish Pensioners Forum said that this is a decision, and I quote, potentially plunging older people into a solitary existence with no means of contact with the outside world. They are right. So will the First Minister add her name to a letter that I am circulating to all party leaders in this Parliament today, calling on Theresa May, in one of her final acts as Prime Minister, to take back responsibility, to honour their 2017 manifesto pledge and reverse this decision, because our pensioners deserve so much better than this?
First Minister.
Well, I'm very happy to look at any letter that Richard Leonard wants to send me, but I have to say the Scottish Government, as far as I understand it, has already written to the Government on this matter, making clear our... so we haven't waited until today. We've, I think, got on and done it. But yes, we will look at any cross-party action. I oppose the decision that's been taken by the BBC. But let me say this, and I think Richard Leonard alluded to this as well. The BBC have been left to take this decision. Yep. The responsibility for the decision lies fairly and squarely with the Tory government at Westminster. So let's all in this chamber, and I would challenge the Tories as well to stand up and back the continuation of free TV licences for all pensioners, not just in Scotland but across the UK.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, but our pensioners suffered another blow this week when the Scottish Government voted to slow down and water down its plans to end fuel poverty. Back in 2008, addressing this Parliament, Nicola Sturgeon said, and I quote, "I reiterate the Scottish Government's continued commitment to tackling fuel poverty and to meet the 2016 target, which is to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, that no one is living in fuel poverty by 2016. But instead of eradicating fuel poverty by 2016, the First Minister now wants to eradicate it by 2040. Instead of a definition of vulnerability that extends to all pensioners, the Scottish Government has now excluded everybody below the age of 75, even though life expectancy in Scotland's most disadvantaged communities is less than 75. First Minister, when will all of Scotland's pensioners finally be lifted out of poverty?
First Minister.
I'm slightly confused because I understand that Labour voted for the fuel poverty bill this week, but it seems a bit strange that Richard Leonard now seems to oppose it. But let me just say to Richard Leonard, if we look at the latest figures published in December last year, they show Scotland's fuel poverty rate at the lowest recorded rate since 2005. But we have work to do. All of us have work to do. That's why we have passed this piece of legislation. Scotland is amongst only a handful of European governments to define fuel poverty, let alone set targets relating to its eradication. So we will continue to work to make sure that we do eradicate fuel poverty. The targets we've set this week will focus us on doing exactly that, and I hope that we've got the support of Scottish Labour, not just in passing the targets, but also in taking the action. We'll make sure that we can meet those targets.
And Richard Leonard.
Well, Presiding Officer, the facts are these. Pensioner poverty up. Free TV licences under attack, care and support needs unmet, life expectancy in Scotland falling, the promise to end fuel poverty broken. Presiding Officer, the way we treat our elderly citizens is a mark of the kind of society we are. These are people who have contributed all of their working lives. Many of them are still contributing today as unpaid carers, yet too many of them are forced to choose between heating and eating. First Minister, your target date to end fuel poverty was 2016, now it's 2040. Does the First Minister appreciate the anger that will be felt by pensioners when they realise not just what the Tories are doing this week, but what this government has done this week?
First Minister.
Well, we will continue being one of the only governments across Europe setting targets to eradicate fuel poverty. But let me say to Richard Leonard, the regulation of energy prices in this country is a reserved matter. Pensions are a reserved matter. Television licences are a reserved matter. So if Richard Leonard wants this government to have responsibility over all of these matters, he'll find that I'm the first to agree with him. So having reversed his position on a second EU referendum at the weekend, maybe he'll now see the light and reverse his position on a second independence referendum so that this Parliament can take control of these matters out of the hands of the Tories and serve our pensioners along with the rest of our country as well.
We have a number of constituency supplementaries. Claire Adamson to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, you may be aware of reports that the First World War Memorial in the Duchess of Hamilton Park in my constituency has been vandalised. My great-uncle is remembered on this memorial. Do you share my disgust at this abhorrent act, especially in such close proximity to the 75th D-Day landing commemorations? And will you join in me in sending a message that hate crimes, hate behaviours have no place in a modern Scotland, and urge those responsible to reflect on the hurt they have caused to my constituents and urge them to come forward and take responsibility for their actions?
First Minister.
Can I thank Claire Adamson for raising this issue? I was extremely disappointed, indeed disgusted, to hear of the vandalism of the World War I memorial in Motherwell, and I join with Claire Adamson and with others in condemning such a wicked and despicable act. And that this did happen at a time when we have been commemorating the sacrifices made by our armed forces makes it all the more abhorrent. Obviously, the police are investigating this. I would call on the perpetrators to reflect on their behaviour and to come forward. But I would also agree with Claire Adamson that all of us must join in sending a very clear message that hate crime has no place in Scotland and it will simply not be tolerated.
Thank you, Colin. Brian Whittle to be followed by Ross Greer. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A charity in my area waiting for European Social Fund payments contacted me to say they're struggling with the costs and only found out there's an issue with the fund when they read about it in a national newspaper. Given the third sector's limited budget and need to control cash flow, does the First Minister think this is an acceptable way for the Scottish Government to communicate with the third sector? And while they're trying to resolve the administration issues with the fund, perhaps the Scottish Government would consider paying their proportion of the grant in advance?
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government met with the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations just yesterday, in fact, to update them on the situation and provide further reassurance. The concerns relate, of course, to evidence provided by lead partners in these projects. It is a common issue with European social funding. Similar problems have been identified in England, but we are determined to avoid any charity or third sector body suffering as a result of this. We continue to make payments to projects unaffected by these issues, and we are working to resolve the situation as quickly as possible with the European Commission. We've already sent a list of proposed solutions to the Commission and await confirmation that it is content to accept them, and these proposals will then ensure that lead partners in the various projects are able to generate the evidence that they need to support their claim for payment. So the Government is and will continue to do everything to resolve this situation as quickly as possible.
Ross Greer to be followed by Fulton MacGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister might be aware of proposals by Peelports for a significant development adjacent to the Hunterston nuclear power station in my region. The proposals are varied. Some of them are very interesting and could potentially provide much-needed jobs. But the one that's providing serious concern for local residents is that for liquefied natural gas, for a terminal, a storage facility and a new gas-fired power station. Does the First Minister agree that new gas-fired power stations in Scotland are not compatible with her declaration of a climate emergency?
First Minister.
Well, I certainly appreciate and echo the sentiments of Ross Greer around the climate emergency, and we want to make sure that we are doing everything possible to meet that challenge. In terms of proposed developments, as Ross Greer is aware, they will have to go through a whole series of applications and considerations, and it would not be correct for me to preempt any of that. But certainly, in terms of our energy policy, and I think this is evidenced across our energy policy, the commitment of this government to tackle climate change and reduce our emissions, I think, is very well evidenced.
Fulton MacGregor, to be followed by Annie Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that the First Minister is aware of the situation at St Ambrose and Buchanan High Schools in my constituency, and I wholeheartedly welcome the announcement yesterday from John Swinney that there will be an independent, impartial review. But given that over 400 people attended a public meeting that I arranged last week, and over 14,000 folk have now signed an online petition, what reassurances can the First Minister give that the review will involve hearing the views of parents and school staff? And will the review's public health lead have the power to order appropriate tests and investigations to get a full understanding of the safety of the site?
First Minister.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to address this issue, which I know is causing considerable concern to parents, despite the efforts of the Council and the Health Board to assure people of the safety of the school. That's why we announced the independent review yesterday. The review will engage with parents, teachers, staff and perhaps most importantly of all, pupils in the schools. Exactly how the review is taken forward is rightly a matter for the review itself, given the importance of ensuring its independence. On the question of testing, the same is true. Let me make clear, if the review's experts conclude that there is a need to recommend further tests on the site itself, or with appropriate parental permission, the pupils, then that is exactly what will happen. But we must respect the review's independence and allow them to come to their own conclusions. I think that is a critical point about this work. The review must both be independent and impartial, and be seen to be independent and impartial. Nothing less will be acceptable to staff, parents and pupils, and nothing less will be acceptable to the government either.
Annie Wells.
In my region of Glasgow and in the First Minister's own constituency, a school has been forced to take desperate action to eliminate a 4-year-long ordeal of bedbug infestations. Kids are getting rashes, pest control teams are visiting every few months, and staff have had to destroy their home furniture. First Minister, what century is this?
First Minister.
This is an issue in different parts of Glasgow. I know from my constituency interest in the case that Annie Wells is citing, the intensive work that is being done by the Council. I speak to Council officials on these matters regularly, and the other issues that are raised in this area of my constituency, and I know the work that is going on is very intensive, and I think all of us have to encourage those involved in this to follow all of the guidelines in order that the work that's been done has the best chance of succeeding.
And question number 3, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. Like me, the First Minister will have received hundreds of emails from constituents this week backing calls for 11% of NHS funding to go to general practice, to let our local surgeries employ more doctors and nurses, to provide longer appointments and to tackle the health inequality that continues to blight Scotland. In April, Parliament voted for the Green motion demanding an urgent review of GP recruitment, resources and funding. So when will the Scottish Government respect the will of Parliament and launch such a review?
First Minister.
Well, we're taking a range of actions to boost recruitment into general practice. In terms of funding, the Government is committed to increasing the proportion of funding going to primary care services to 11%. Half of that will go to GPs in particular, but of course GPs do not work in isolation. Increasingly, it's the entire primary care team that is important in terms of delivering the services in communities that people need and shifting the balance of care from acute services to primary care. So we continue to work to achieve that aim, and we continue to work across the different ways, the different actions that we are taking to ensure that we are recruiting the right numbers of people, not just into general practice, but into different professions across our health service.
Alison Johnson.
The fact is the overwhelming majority of patient contacts are made with our GPs, yet they receive less than 8% of the NHS budget. 11% may be going to primary care. The call is that 11% goes to GP practices. They're overstretched and under-resourced. A quarter of GPs don't think they'll be in general practice 5 years from now. And the RCGP are warning that this is putting patient safety at risk, this untenable situation. If we want to look after people in their homes and communities, rather than in our hospitals, we need more GPs. The RCGP says that surgeries will struggle to deliver the healthcare we need without at least 11% of NHS funding. Are the GPs wrong?
First Minister.
Continue to talk to and work with GPs. I understand the Health Secretary will meet with the Royal College shortly to have further discussions about their report. We're taking a range of actions in terms of recruitment. The number of trainee doctors, for example, has increased by more than 10% since 2007, and the majority of new places are focused on primary care and general practice. The number of trainee GPs in 2018 was its highest level for over a decade. So we'll continue to take those actions. In terms of funding, we have the commitment to increase the share of funding going to primary care, and we will meet that commitment. General practice is a vital part of that, but I think as anybody who understands how the health service works will know, and I know Alison Johnson knows this, general practice does not work in isolation. They are part of a multidisciplinary team, so increasing the share of funding going to primary care not just helps the entirety of the primary care team, it also helps general practice because it has tasks that might currently be done by GPs able to be done by other members of the team. So this is an important commitment and we will continue to make progress in meeting it.
And some further supplementaries. The first from Joanne Lamont, to be followed by Sandra White. Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware of the advance payment scheme for older survivors of in-care child abuse. In a recent written answer to me, the Cabinet Secretary for Education said that no application to the scheme had been refused. Some survivors, however, are reporting that applications have been refused on the grounds that they do not have the documents to prove where they were in care. And of course we know that some organisations running children's homes destroyed many of their historical records. May I ask the First Minister to have this investigated as a matter of urgency, given the distress this may be causing to people who throughout their lives have had their trust betrayed?
First Minister.
Well, I hope Joanne Lamont will recognise this is a very important issue that has been taken very seriously by the Government. We owe a debt to these people and we are determined to do what we can to repay that debt. My understanding, although of course we will look into the information that Joanne Lamont has just provided to the Chamber, but my understanding is that so far no application has been refused for lack of documentation. Now Joanne Lamont is giving me different information and I will make sure the Deputy First Minister looks into that and will write to Joanne Lamont as soon as we're in the position to do so.
Sandra White, to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the announcement that Serco are planning to resume their lock change eviction programme across Glasgow. Can the First Minister tell me what action the Scottish Government will take to prevent this inhumane treatment of asylum seekers by Serco?
First Minister.
Well, I deeply regret Serco's decision. I think it is inhumane that people can be evicted from their homes by the locks being changed. The Scottish Government has made its views known on this. We have worked and will continue to work with Glasgow City Council to protect asylum seekers as much as we possibly can. But the root problem here is the inhumane asylum policy pursued by the Home Office and the UK Government. That's what needs to change. And perhaps Ruth Davidson, given her partnership at the moment with the current Home Secretary, will take the opportunity to ask the Home Secretary to end a situation where people can be evicted from their homes in this way. And I look forward to hearing from her when she's done so.
Ian Gray, to be followed by Jenny Gilruth. Ian Gray.
Figures today show that Scottish student debt has soared to £5.5 billion. 3 times what it was in 2007. Average individual debt is more than double what it was when the SNP came to power. When the First Minister says, judge her by her record on education, aren't Scotland's students and graduates who were promised no student debt at all entitled to judge this a betrayal which grows bigger year by year?
First Minister.
Well, let me just focus on what exactly the loan debt figures are. In England, the individual loan debt figures are £35,950. In Labour-run Wales, £22,920. In Northern Ireland, £23,550. And in Scotland, £13,800. Some £9,000 lower than in Wales, where Labour are in government. Average student debt in Scotland did increase in the most recent year by £670. In Labour-run Wales, it increased by £1,610. Labour's hypocrisy on this issue knows no bounds. The fact of the matter is, we are increasing support for students, we are increasing student bursaries, and we are determined to keep education in Scotland free. That's the difference between the SNP, the Tories, Labour and the Liberals.
Jenny Gilruth, to be followed by Mark Griffin. Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's Daily Record reports on the latest priority for the Tory party. They want their new Westminster leader to rip up the Scotland Act and to seize control of spending and decision-making in devolved areas. Does the First Minister condemn this latest attempt at a power grab on Scotland's Parliament?
First Minister.
Well, I think everything the Tories do and say right now, and in fact the shrill way in which they say it, just demonstrates that they know they are losing the argument on independence, so they're reduced to trying to frustrate democracy. The Tories are not interested in more money for Scotland. If they were, they'd have stood up against the cuts imposed upon this Parliament by the Tory government. What the Tories are interested in is undermining the Scottish Parliament. We've already had the legislative power grab. We've seen this week the petty, though completely unsuccessful attempt to constrain the ability of the Scottish and Welsh governments to represent our interests overseas. And now we have the money grab. I think we're learning two things. Firstly, the Tories cannot be trusted with devolution. But the second thing is perhaps more interesting. The Tories know, the Scottish Tories know, they are never going to be in government in Scotland, because if they had any hope of that, they wouldn't be allowing a Tory government to undermine this Parliament in the way that they are.
Mark Griffin, to be followed by Emma Harper. Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of press reports that the GMB union are battling 300 members of staff at Myers Hospital on taking strike action. A payroll system change means collectively they owed £72,000, are being paid 2 weeks' wages for 3 weeks' work, and have been offered a loan instead of wages they are rightfully owed, pushing many into debt. Will the Scottish Government make a public intervention in this, in line with the wishes of the workforce, to make sure staff are paid what they are owed, avert any strike action and the likely knock-on effect for patients in my region?
First Minister.
Well, the Health Secretary has already made a public intervention. She's written to the company, she's met with the union concerned and continues to encourage the company to adopt an approach which is fair to staff and also avoids any disruption to services. And we will continue to do everything we can as a government to bring about that resolution. Of course, this issue comes from the PFI contract around Myers Hospital, which I seem to remember came about under the last Labour administration. So this is one of the symptoms of PFI that Labour was so happy to support all these years ago and now has the nerve to stand up in this Parliament and complain about. So we will continue to do the work we can to resolve it. But perhaps Labour should spend a bit more time reflecting on why we find ourselves in this situation.
Emma Harper.
To ask whether the Scottish Government has had any contact from Dumfries and Galloway Council following the closure of Church Street in Stranraer due to safety concerns over the dilapidated Grade B listed George Hotel, and whether assistance could be offered.
First Minister.
Well, we'll be happy to liaise with the Council and do everything we can to help with this situation, which I know is of concern to Emma Harper's constituents. I'll be happy to ask the relevant Minister to look further into this and get back to Emma Harper as soon as possible.
Thank you. Question number 4, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government is doing to make people aware of scams in light of reports that nearly half of people in Scotland have been targeted at least once in the last year.
First Minister.
The number of people targeted by scams is of great concern. The Scottish Government believes that prevention through education and raising awareness is key to reducing the harm caused. We are currently funding Citizens Advice Scotland to deliver an awareness campaign in partnership with Trading Standards, Police Scotland, Young Scot, Age Scotland and other agencies. The campaign launched this week and aims to challenge perceptions and stigma associated with scams, urging people to speak up and report them. We also fund Crime Stoppers, who have been working with Police Scotland on the Shut Out Scammers campaign to raise awareness of doorstep crime and protect the most vulnerable in society. We're also currently working with stakeholders to develop a prevention strategy to ensure a more coordinated response to tackling this issue across government.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the First Minister for that reply. And does the First Minister agree with me that the Citizens Advice Scotland and Police Scotland's efforts to make people aware of scams are welcome? However, we should all remain vigilant and highlight that whether or not scammers are successful, they are committing a crime. And does the First Minister also agree with me that this is a continual problem and we need to continue that partnership working to both raise people's awareness as well as target these criminals?
First Minister.
Yes, I agree with all of that. We must be vigilant and report any concerns to the police, regardless of whether or not a scammer is successful. As I've just said, the Scottish Government is working with a range of partners to embed cyber resilience within our education and lifelong learning systems at all levels, and that will help to ensure that everyone has a fundamental awareness of cyber risk and how they can take basic but important steps to reduce that risk. I very much agree that this is an ongoing problem, and partnership working of the type that I spoke about in my initial answer will be key to raising awareness and preventing crimes of this nature.
And Maurice Corrie.
Now, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives called for a vulnerable persons aggravator almost exactly a year ago after it was recommended by the Brackendale Review. This would see those who commit crimes targeted at the elderly and disabled punished more harshly by the courts. Why has the SNP government failed to introduce this?
First Minister.
Well, we obviously consulted on changes to hate crime legislation. The results of that are currently being taken forward, and Parliament will continue to scrutinise the decisions government makes and ultimately the decisions Parliament makes. It is important that we consider carefully any aggravations to crime, making sure that we have the right evidence base in place and that we're taking the right action to protect vulnerable groups, whoever they are, and we will continue to take action of that type.
Question number 5, Jamie Green.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to strike action taking place at Glasgow and Aberdeen airports.
First Minister.
Well, it's very disappointing that this industrial action is taking place. It is a matter for AGS Airports and the trade union, and I would encourage them to work together to reach a resolution to the dispute. I appreciate that the strikes will be concerning for passengers, particularly as we enter the summer holiday season. I know that measures have been put in place to minimise the impact on passengers, and no flights have been cancelled at either airport because of the industrial action. But I would urge AGS Airports and Unite to continue talks to resolve this matter and avoid any disruption to passengers.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the First Minister for that response? The First Minister will no doubt be aware of the strategic importance of the airport to both the city but the wider West of Scotland region, to both business and tourism, and I'm sure the same can be said of Aberdeen. Given that there are potential further strikes planned, and this is the peak travel season upon us, it is important this dispute is resolved fairly but quickly. So can I ask for further information on how the Government, its ministers or indeed its agencies will provide assistance to either party to help settle this dispute quickly?
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government is not a party to this dispute, and I'm sure that is appreciated. That said, the Scottish Government always stands ready to help if there is help that we can provide to help resolve disputes like this. But this is fundamentally an issue between the airport company and the trade unions. I would, as I did a moment ago, encourage them to work together with a view to reaching a resolution that will avoid disruption for passengers, but also a resolution that is fair to the workers in the airports. The airport company is a private company, so we don't have a direct role in the talks, but of course we want to see it resolved as quickly as possible, and if there is anything that we can reasonably do to help bring about that outcome, we stand ready to do it.
And Neil Bibby.
Hundreds of workers in my region have been forced to strike because their pay and pensions have been attacked in violation of an ACAS agreement, and strike-breaking labour is being used despite serious safety concerns. Unite have repeatedly offered to talk up and to strike action, yet the airport, which has made over £90 million of profits, will not work with the union to end this dispute. Given the airport's vast profits, profits that are projected to grow by a further 6%, can the First Minister justify why workers, hundreds of workers in my region should be treated in this way?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government is not a party to this dispute. AGS Airports is a private company, but I was very deliberate in what I said in my previous answer, that I want to see a resolution to this that avoids passenger disruption, but that is also fair to those who work in the airport, because as with any company, it cannot function without the work of the employees there. So I want to see fairness for workers. I would encourage the airport to get round the table with trade unions and come to a resolution, and I hope all members will do so. But it has to be based on a recognition that this is not a dispute that the Scottish Government is a party to. That doesn't stop us encouraging those who are parties to this dispute to get round the table and come up with a solution that is fundamentally a fair one.
And question number 6, Jackie Bailey.
For what reason only £3.2 million out of a £200 million Scottish European co-investment programme has been spent on supporting Scottish businesses?
First Minister.
The Scottish European Growth Co-Investment Programme has provided £12 million of investment so far. The £3.2 million referred to is the Scottish Enterprise contribution and refers to deals or includes deals currently being finalised. There have been some challenges to take up of the scheme, including ongoing uncertainty around Brexit. Scottish Enterprise is continuing to work with investors and companies to secure investment decisions and maximise the number of businesses who benefit from the scheme. The Government is committed to supporting small businesses. Of course, the co-investment programme is just one part of the Scottish Growth Scheme, which is funding a range of financial interventions aimed at helping SMEs realise their growth and export ambitions. And the Growth Scheme overall has supported 158 companies with £125 million of investment so far.
Jackie Bailey.
I have to say to the First Minister, 12 million out of 200 million isn't that much better. At a time where the economy appears to be contracting, manufacturing is declining, and small business confidence, according to the Clydesdale Bank SME Health Check Index, is at its lowest level since they started recording it. When the fund was announced in the programme for government in 2016, it was welcomed across this chamber. It was designed to help businesses grow in the face of Brexit. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance claimed this week that the very fund to help prepare for Brexit had been affected by Brexit. Can the First Minister tell me whether the Scottish Government completely misread the market, given that there is so little demand, and will the co-investment programme, which is largely financial transaction money, be revised to ensure that the right help is available for businesses in these very difficult times?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, in response to that last part of the question, of course, we will always look at how we make sure that we are providing the kind of help that businesses need. And if we need to make changes to the design of programmes, we will certainly do that. But I think most people would understand and appreciate that Brexit has had and is having an impact on investment decisions. And that is having a knock-on impact in the number of companies that are coming forward to schemes like this. And that is simply a reality that I would have thought Labour, at the very least, if not the Tories, would have been able to understand. But the growth scheme overall is helping a number of companies, as I said, 158 companies with £125 million of investment so far, and we'll continue to do everything we can to make sure that this very helpful funding gets to companies, but we require companies to come forward with investment propositions, and we will keep encouraging them to do so.
And Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the 2016 programme for government, the First Minister announced that the Scottish Growth Scheme would provide £500 million of loans and guarantees to business. But support under this scheme is now largely in the form of equity finance. So can the First Minister explain why Scottish firms now have to sell part of their business, often to foreign fund managers, in order to get support under the Scottish Growth Scheme?
First Minister.
There's a range of financial interventions that are available, and there will be discussions with companies about what suits their business needs most, whether that is loan funding or other forms of funding into businesses. But I would have hoped that a Conservative member would also have recognised that these schemes are impacted right now by companies' reluctance to invest because of the Brexit uncertainty. And for a Tory in particular to ask a question about this, seemingly oblivious to that, I think just underlines the fact that the Tories have no regard whatsoever to the damage their policies are doing to the economy of the UK right now.
Thank you very much, and that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Gillian Martin on World Environment Day 2019. But we'll just take, in fact, we'll have a short suspension to allow members, the Minister and members in the public gallery to change seats. A short suspension.
May I ask those members of the public who are not remaining for the next item of business to leave quietly, please? Thank you. And the next item of business is members' business debate on motion 17329 in the name of Gillian Martin on World Environment Day 2019. And this debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I say at the outset that this debate is quite heavily subscribed, so I'll have to be strict on timings to allow us time to get the chamber ready for a 2 o'clock start. So would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons. And I call on Gillian Martin to open the debate for 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I am delighted to be able to open this debate to celebrate Environment Day and to highlight the importance of biodiversity to our environment and to give all of our species champions a chance to highlight the importance of their species to the natural balance which must be protected at all costs. From a tiny insect which pollinates our plant life to a giant cetacean which inhabits our seas and everything in between. Everything has its place. And when the population of a species decreases or is at threat of extinction, that fine balance is disturbed and that will impact us all. And that's why the motion highlights the Scotland's Nature on Red Alert report by Environment Link and WWF Scotland, which outlines the key areas of concern. A threat to that natural balance is a fairly successful species, and that's us, human beings. And there's no doubt that human beings have caused the global warming that is the biggest threat to our plants, birds, insects and animals. So it's our moral duty to be actively delivering the solution to that problem. A warming climate has the potential to impact biodiversity both globally and locally. And if you're not convinced by the moral obligation argument, you can look at it from an anthropocentric point of view. Biodiversity has a key role to play in many of the ecosystems that we depend on as human beings, such as nutrient cycling and pollination. Any negative impacts on our biodiversity will potentially affect our food and water supply and our air quality, basically our life support systems. The State of Nature 2016 report indicated that almost 1 in 10 Scottish species are at risk of extinction. Species that could be affected in Scotland include some of our iconic wildlife, like the capercaillie, the puffin, kittiwake and other seabirds, from the freshwater pearl mussel to the Atlantic salmon. Marine species at their southern limit in Scotland, such as the Arctic char and the white-beaked dolphin, may simply not swim in our Scottish waters anymore. And the same goes for smaller fish and organisms, which are an important food source for other species. Increasing acidification of the oceans may also affect not just our wildlife, but our shellfish industries. And our world-renowned salmon rivers may lose more fish as water temperatures rise and summer water levels decline. Plant communities will change as populations of upland species are reduced, and if our peatlands dry out, they can no longer store as much carbon for us, and our rivers may no longer protect us from flooding if rainfall levels rise. And as any farmer will tell you, last year's dry summer had a massive impact on their crop production and feedstocks for their animals. Now, changes to human behaviour are the key to halting declines in species populations, and as the newly appointed grey seal champion, I know this only too well. Globally, the grey seal is one of the rarest seal species, and about 50% of the world's population lives in British and Irish waters. And at the start of the 20th century, it was estimated that there were only 250 grey seals left in UK waters, and they were near extinction. Now, certainly in my home village of Newborough, I rarely saw a seal in the Eithin estuary growing up in the 1980s, as they were routinely shot by those who had fishing interests. And now, as a result of a range of protection measures, the grey seals are thriving, not least on the Eithin estuary, where we have the largest colony in the UK. Now, earlier this week, I promised the pupils of Balmildy Primary that I would tell the story of why I feel particularly qualified to be the grey seal champion. 8 years ago, whilst walking with my daughter in the Eithin estuary, we encountered a small grey seal who'd beached herself, exhausted from hauling metres and metres of fishing net and rope behind her was tangled round her neck. Every time we approached to try and disentangle her, she scarpered back into the river. And worried about distressing her further, we left her be and we continued on our walk. But we spotted her on the way back. This time she was so exhausted she no longer had the energy to move away from us. And I managed to get hold of the rope that had embedded itself in the skin of her neck, and I pulled it off, but not before she sunk her sharp teeth into my wrist and secured me an appointment at A&E later that day. And I've still got a fairly large scar. Members will be aware of the origins of Spider-Man. Peter Parker was bitten by a spider and developed spider-like powers. Now, who knows what that seal bite gave me? I've yet to discover an increase in my swimming skills, so being their champion will have to suffice until the powers inevitably reveal themselves. My Marvel Seal Girl backstory is a funny story to tell the kids in the schools, but in all seriousness, I want to use my position as a grey seal champion to campaign against fishing gear and other debris that causes the entanglement of our marine species, seal and cetacean. I also want to help local campaigners who want to educate the public on the best way to view the seals without disturbing them. And that would be from the other side of the River Eithin, go to Newborough Beach instead, and you can view the colony there, get a better view, and actually the seals will come up to you rather than bolting in panic away from you. I'm also lucky enough to be the champion of the world's oldest tree species, the yew. The yew, which itself is also a superhero. Members may remember my speech last year where I called it the Doctor Who of trees, due to the tree's powers to regenerate and live on and on and on, defying mortality. Not to mention its life-saving powers as an ingredient in cancer drugs. Now, our woodland species champions will know that the decrease in native species of tree means huge loss of species habitat and ultimately no life support for our insects and mammals, including us upright mammals. Nearly half of our native woodland is in poor condition for biodiversity, and out of all the ancient woodland mapped in Scotland around 40 years ago, around 12.5% has been lost to fragmentation and failed regeneration. This is a trend that must be reversed if we're to protect our most biodiverse habitats and sequester the amount of carbon we need to halt climate change. New woodland creation and natural regeneration will need to happen at a faster and far greater scale than ever before. Natural regeneration across Scotland is severely impacted by grazing from herbivores, particularly deer. And woodland regeneration could provide both new habitat and extend existing ranges for many woodland-dependent species. Presiding Officer, biodiversity loss will affect us all. And before I sit down, I just want to say how heartened I am that so many of my colleagues have asked to speak in this debate to highlight the importance of Scotland's natural heritage. And I look forward to hearing about the species that they hold most dear and continue to champion. Presiding Officer.
We move to the open debate and speeches of absolutely no more than 4 minutes, please. Alexander Burnett, followed by Keith Brown.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And as the species champion for the pearl mussel, I'm delighted to take part in this debate today brought by Gillian Martin and raise the issues of this endangered species. I'm lucky enough to live beside the River Dee, one of the most famous salmon rivers in the world, and anyone who's been there will tell you how incredible it is, and we welcome people from across the world in their bid to cast a fly for our salmon. And not to disappoint expectations, can I please note members to my register of interests in relation to the Dee. Now, for those who don't know, salmon stocks are very important in the battle to increase pearl mussel numbers, as the larvae rely on host fish, such as salmon, for their survival. And with pearl mussels each releasing around 2 to 3 million larvae, they are either inhaled or settle in the gills of salmon. And remaining there in the winter and dropping off into the gravel the following spring, you can see why salmon stocks are so important to the survival of pearl mussels. And therefore a coordinated effort is required to help save this endangered species. And I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about 3 different projects that are happening across Scotland in a bid to improve salmon stock and consequently pearl mussel numbers. So firstly, at Dryhope Farm in the Scottish Borders, which won the Scottish Land and Estates Enhancing Our Environment Award in 2018, this project linked upland peatland restoration with the salmon fishing on the River Tweed, from catchment to catching fish. And it found that damaged peat and drainage channels were reducing the capacity of peatland to stay wet and regulate water flow. And so by restoring these, it meant that gravels could be stabilised so that fish over are not swept away and become unviable. And this sees an increase in fish stock, which ultimately benefits pearl mussels. And as a side note, this project also increases carbon storage, improves water quality, and creates better habitats for upland wildlife such as black grouse and hen harriers, which I know the Minister champions. A fantastic project for much of the local environment. Now, another project which has created a huge boost for pearl mussel numbers is that of the Ness and Bewley Fisheries Trust. Now, after obtaining further funding from SSE, they continued the work of the Pearls in Peril project, which meant that over 2,500 fish were exposed to pearl mussel larvae between 2012 and 2018. And in 2017, monitoring showed that up to 25% of all fish captured were now carrying the larvae, with over 100 on each gill in some cases. And the final project is where Vattenfall UK has committed €3 million to several research projects, of which the River Dee Trust, Aberdeenshire and Marine Scotland have all gained a share in. And locally, they are looking to provide previously unknown information on salmon and sea trout movements out at sea. And I'm grateful to Vattenfall for contributing to this important research. Now, whilst we welcome companies investing in restoring our environment, we also need the Scottish Government to do more. And whilst legislation has made poaching pearl mussels illegal, not enough is being done to enforce this. So we need to take further steps, not only to prevent illegal poaching, but also improve the numbers of both this endangered species and host species, such as salmon, which are also under threat. Because we cannot just rely on private companies to make the investment, and so I urge the SNP government to do more to protect our environment. Thank you.
Keith Brown, followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also thank Gillian Martin for securing this debate to celebrate World Environment Day held earlier this month. The theme for this year's World Environment Day is air pollution, with 9 out of 10 people around the world shockingly breathing in polluted air. Even travelling through to and from Edinburgh, there is a noticeable change between city life and my own constituency of Clapmannshire and Dunblane. And luckily, if ever I feel the need for a lungful of fresh air, I'm completely spoiled with some of the best hill walking in all of Scotland. And if members here wish to join me and stretch their legs in Scotland's most stunning constituency, they're more than welcome to join me, and you can bring your own sticks. Where we might come across if we do take that walk across the very rare and endangered sticky catchfly, a plant that I'm delighted to be the species champion for. And, Presiding Officer, I was going to test your patience and bring a sample of it in today, a sample of sticky catchfly, I should say, in today. But unfortunately, it is endangered and it's very fragile. It's restricted to just a few sites in Wales and Scotland, but it can also be found in Arthur's Seat, just behind us here in Edinburgh. But it's most often to be found in the hillfoot cliffs of the South Ochils, and these hills are lit up by clusters of beautiful pink flowers and are home to the largest population of sticky catchfly in the UK. So it's a great pleasure as species champion to have the opportunity. I will do, yes.
Bruce Crawford. Mr Crawford, your microphone's not on.
Okay, it's on now then. I thank the member for giving way, because I've got to go to another event which I'm chairing at 1 o'clock. But I wonder if he would agree with me, given that I'm the species champion for the slow worm, that it's a grand thing that the slow worm is one of the most sexually active species on the planet.
I'm not entirely sure
Keith
to respond to it, but I suppose in the interest of the sustainability of the species, it must be a good thing. But to get back to sticky catch fly, it is, as I say, a great pleasure to be species champion for it. And also to work with organisations like Stirling and Clackmannanshire Scottish Wildlife Trust Local Group and the Alva Glen Heritage Trust, and to learn more about the vital work they do to protect local biodiversity and encourage the growth of sticky catch fly. Incredibly important reintroduction work with seeds collected from the yellow cliffs above Blair Logie, which Bruce Crawford will be very familiar with, and grown in allotments in Bridge of Allen. It's successfully seen 40 sticky catchfly plants reintroduced across areas like Alva Glen, where sticky catchfly has become extinct. Rumoured to have been King James VI of Scotland's favourite flower 400 years ago. It's down to the invaluable dedication of Stirling and Clackmannanshire Welfare Trust that it may be enjoyed, hopefully, for a further 400 years in the future. And as species champions, I think we all know just how crucial the local work done by wildlife groups is in order to protect the vulnerable and endangered species that we represent. And that great work extends past species and also to the environment itself. We also must see the work to protect species as part of wider efforts to tackle climate breakdown. And under this Scottish Government, Scotland is seen as a world leader in setting ambitious green targets, and rightly so. And again, in my constituency of Clackmannanshire and Dunblane, it's seen to be a green leader here in Scotland. Under the Stirling and Clackmannanshire City Region deal, it will become the base for Scotland's International Environment Centre, a £22 million investment which will create a research and policy hub at the University of Stirling, an environmental business incubator in Clackmannanshire. And that will be tasked with providing a comprehensive approach to unlocking inclusive and green economic growth. Stirling and Clackmannanshire will therefore be at the forefront of providing the conditions for Scottish business to prosper in a way that ensures a cleaner, sustainable and healthier environment for the generations that follow. So today's debate serves, I hope, as a powerful reminder that now is the time to act. And locally and nationally here in Scotland, we are stepping up to this challenge. It's my wish to see this ambition matched by our friends across the UK, across the EU, indeed across the world, that we tackle climate breakdown to secure a future tomorrow for the species we champion in the Chamber today.
Claudia Beamish, followed by Shona Robson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too would like to thank Gillian Martin for bringing her motion to debate today. World Environment Day 2019 gives us a poignant reminder of the stark reality facing our natural environment. As Gillian Martin's motion highlights, nearly 1 in 10 species are at risk of extinction here in Scotland, and 1 in 25 are under threat worldwide, and the world is on red alert for its future. Yet progress is being made, and we can and must save our biodiversity for future generations. However, we must act now. Scottish Labour recently announced a climate emergency, as did the Scottish Government, and I was proud to vote to support this in the Parliament. This is an important step in recognising the serious state of affairs. However, I also call on the Scottish Government to declare an environment emergency, and what better time to do this than in the context of World Environment Day, and I hope the Minister will consider this call and make comment on it. The interrelationship between the effects of climate change and our environment are increasingly evidenced. We are unlikely to meet our country's internationally binding 2020 biodiversity targets. What we now need is a bold and inclusive set of actions to establish a post-2020 biodiversity action plan. And can the Minister give some reassurance about how this will be developed in her closing remarks? I was happy to see the species champions recognised in this motion and the small part that we can play in highlighting the work of the tireless volunteers and organisations who work to protect the range of rare and wonderful animal, plants and species which we also support. I'm the champion of the forester moth, and it is not well known how they are faring due to their very elusive nature. Despite their beauty, being emerald green daytime moths, they are very shy. When I went to the Maybe Forest in Dumfries to do some forester moth spotting, I enjoyed being there in the dappled wooded glades with their marshlands as well, that mixed habitat that the the moth needs, and it's a very specialised one, but I didn't see a single forester moth. However, the Butterfly Conservation Society Scotland now have developed a lure. Don't worry, it's not something scary, it's just to help to attract the moths so they can be spotted in different places. So, better luck next time. A forester moth has been seen in a new site in Mull, which is very exciting, and the caterpillars are now found in what is probably the first time in Scotland in Argyll last year. And the Butterfly Conservation Society are also working with farmers promoting the Agro-Environment and Climate Scheme. This encourages farmers to maintain suitable sites for cattle grazing, which is also essential for the forester moth. And these schemes and those protecting the rest of our wildlife must not be threatened due to Brexit, whatever the future may hold. All the Scottish Labour MSPs are indeed species champions now, and I'm not going to name and shame anyone in any other party who isn't. However, I do think it would be a really good story to tell if the whole Parliament, all the MSPs, were champions. And I do want to highlight that my friend and colleague Alex Rowley is actually the species champion for the what is it? The narrow-headed ant. Thank you. The narrow-headed ant. And he has actually spotted this in the Perthshire Highlands. In my own motion, I recognise that this year's World Environment Day theme is Beat Air Pollution. And I was outside the Parliament to support campaigners on Tuesday in relation to the bill of Mark Ruskell's that we will be looking at this afternoon. And really, I do believe that the Scottish Government will have a change of heart on this and see how much sense it makes. And let's help beat air pollution as a mark of respect for World Environment Day and give relief to those living in poor local environments. And I would like again to thank Gillian Martin for creating the opportunity to look forward to creating robust actions for a better environment from local to global. Thank you.
Shona Robson, followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to also thank my fellow champion Gillian Martin for securing this important debate and declare an interest as the species champion for the wild cherry, a tree with white flowers as distinct from the more common and familiar pink cherry tree. When we think of Scotland's natural heritage, our biodiversity and the threats faced by many species across our land, it's the threat to our native fauna which tends to make the headlines, but our flora is of equal, if not more, importance as plants underpin all life on Earth. I recently had the pleasure to visit a great example of the wild cherry tree in bloom in Dawson Park in my constituency. The visit was organised by the Woodland Trust Scotland, who I'd like to thank for the work that they do in the creation, restoration and maintenance of our woodlands. The Trust has identified that at least 46% of our native woodland is in poor condition, and around 12.5% of our ancient woodland has been lost to fragmentation and failed regeneration over the past 40 years. We also spoke of the benefits of woodlands in tackling climate change and its effects, from carbon capture, moderating the local climate and saving energy, flood management and improving our health and clean air. A recent study in Chicago has shown that the trees in the city remove 10.8 tonnes of pollutant material a day. And a University of Columbia study has shown that the asthma rates among children aged 4 to 5 fell by 25% when in areas where there was a concentration of trees. Given that the UK has one of the world's highest rates of childhood asthma, with around 15% of children affected, and with a higher prevalence in lower socioeconomic groups in urban areas, this is an important benefit of urban woodlands. Therefore, I'm encouraged that the Scottish Government recognises the importance of woodland and is to be applauded for its work on forestation efforts, which in 2017 saw 14 million new trees planted, accounting for more than 3/4 of tree planting in the UK. The Scottish Government's Scottish Forestry Strategy also notes the importance of urban woodlands and aims to increase urban tree canopy across Scotland's towns and cities, which Dundee does quite well for, but there's progress to be made. Something I very much welcome, and we'd be interested in learning from the Minister what specific steps the Government is considering in order to further support this aim. Another benefit which was highlighted on my visit was the positive effect trees and woodlands can have on people's well-being. In Dawson Park, alongside the beautiful cherry blossoms, sits the Duntroon Community Gardens, which is managed and maintained by the Scottish Association for Mental Health in partnership with Dundee City Council. From the Gardens, Sam H runs its Chrysalis project, a therapeutic horticultural service which works with people to support their recovery journey by developing self-resilience and employability skills. Examples like Chrysalis are important to highlight, for they illustrate the important part that green spaces of all shapes and sizes play, not only in protecting the environment but in the benefit they bring to the people around them. If we are to protect Scotland's nature, flora or fauna, raising awareness, engaging with local communities and encouraging them to take action individually and collectively is paramount and must be part of our future thinking on these issues. In Dundee, I'm proud of the fact that this thinking is already firmly embedded in our approach to the protection and enhancement of our urban woodlands. Dundee's strategic plan states that the woodlands are a vital element in delivering our vision for the city by helping to build stronger communities, promote social inclusion and active citizenship through community ownership and local participation in the management of our green spaces. Having identified the importance of local woodlands in supporting health and wellbeing, Dundee City Council applied for funding from a variety of sources and was successful, and to be congratulated on following through on 21 projects and using the funding to increase community involvement, working through the establishment of Dundee Trees and Woods in Green Space. So I wonder if the Minister could take the opportunity in responding to outline what the Government's current thinking is on funding such projects. Thank you.
Speeches are starting to go over that 4-minute mark, which may disadvantage those later on. So can I have Alison Johnson followed by Angus MacDonald, please?
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Gillian Martin for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. As we mark World Environment Day. It has taken decades, but we've finally reached a point where news about our natural environment makes daily headlines and where we can no longer claim ignorance of the impact human activity is having on the natural ecosystems that sustain us, although sadly a few prominent individuals continue to do so. I congratulate the efforts of environmental NGOs who've contributed to this growing awareness, including the members of Scottish Environment Link and their Scotland's Nature on Red Alert report. This report brings home the realities of what biodiversity loss might look like in Scotland. Fewer wild salmon as the water temperatures of our rivers and oceans rise. Fewer kittiwakes, a common sight along our coastlines. They've already seen their population decline by 66%. And some native woodland plants could disappear as climate change intensifies. As their report makes clear, our habitats and our species are of value not just in their own right, but also for the ecosystem services they support and on which we all depend. That's why the findings of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service should be a call to action. The scientists show that nature is facing more trouble now than at any other point in human history, due to pressures from human society, including expanding agricultural lands, overfishing and pollution. 1 million species may be pushed to extinction in the coming decade, with extraordinary consequences for life on this planet. This has major implications for our food systems, for human health and for water security. Now, the future might seem bleak, but the co-chairman of the IPBES report, Dr. Joseph Zetelu, has stressed that society can mitigate many of the worst effects by changing the way we grow our food, the way we generate energy, by our response to the climate emergency, how we recycle our waste. The key message from the scientist is that we need transformative change. And of course, individuals can act. We can change our diets, we can choose active travel, we can reduce our consumption to limit demand on those natural resources. But we've got to acknowledge that 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial age. They've got to change their behaviour. And the situation also puts a responsibility on national governments and indeed parliaments around the world to respond, including here in Scotland. We're fast approaching the end date of Scotland's 2020 biodiversity roadmap, but 1 in 11 Scottish species are at risk of extinction, and we're on track to meet only 7 of the 20 targets set by the international community to protect biodiversity. I do think there's a tendency for us to focus overwhelmingly on the aspects of the interlinked climate and environmental emergencies that affect us humans, But our policies and actions need to recognise that the value in our plant and animal species, they're valuable in their own right. As a passionate species for the brown and mountain hare, I'm well aware of the impact that climate change is having on the mountain hare, whose snow-white winter coat is making them, it's marking them out to predators in our warmer winters where some hillsides see no snowfall. But thankfully, many of the actions we need to take to address the climate emergency involve restoring our natural habitats, and they'll be critical to tackling the biodiversity crisis too. That includes restoring our peatlands, planting native woodland species, holding back from building new roads, and applying smarter planning principles to ensure our towns and cities incorporate the maximum amount of green space. In closing, Presiding Officer, I really would like to mark the work of the late Polly Higgins. She was an inspirational lawyer who campaigned throughout her life for the crime of ecocide to be established in international law. Ecocide is the loss and damage of ecosystems by corporate and state actors, and she was determined there should be higher accountability for crimes against nature. In 2010, she presented her proposal to the UN, and she continued to champion the cause until her untimely death in April this year. I hope the Scottish Parliament can continue to find the opportunity to work to strengthen the protections for wildlife and habitats in this country, fighting the climate and environmental emergency. Thank you.
Can I ask remaining speakers to consider coming in at 3.5 minutes, please? Angus MacDonald, followed by Finlay Carson.
Okay, thanks, Presiding Officer. June the 5th was indeed World Environment Day, as is highlighted in Gillian Martin's welcome motion, which has helped give focus to the need for nature-based solutions to be deployed to tackle both climate change, but also help make our nature more resilient. Now, the Scottish Government are clearly making significant progress in tackling climate change, but we also need to up our game in addressing biodiversity loss as well. We are, as we know, in a climate emergency, and according to Scottish Environment Link at an event I hosted yesterday, an ecological emergency as well. So there's no doubt we must redouble our efforts to protect our environment and reverse the effects of climate change. And of course the importance of protecting our environment cannot be overstated. It's a fact that sea levels are rising and we're seeing more extreme weather than ever before. Insects and invertebrates are in decline, although not entirely because of climate change, but also through habitat destruction and biodiversity loss, which in turn clearly affects climate change and our environment. One way to help keep the issue on everyone's radar is through the Species Champion initiative. So BugLife Scotland tasked me with being the species champion for the bog sun jumper spider, or Heliophanus damphi to those of us who are more acquainted with the wee critter. And I can assure the Chamber that it is cuter than it sounds. Okay, it's not cuddly, but it is cute. But unfortunately, like Gillian Martin, I have not acquired any spider-like powers since becoming the species champion for the spider, but I live in hope, I think. So at just 3 millimetres long, the spider might be very small, but it's huge in character, mainly black in colour, but they have distinctively striking iridescent green mouthparts. And they're also incredibly rare, found only in 6 places across the UK, 5 in Scotland and 1 in Wales, 2 of which are in my own constituency of Falkirk East. Now, coal bed methane extraction in my patch was a further threat to this little spider. So that's another otherwise unknown positive unintended consequence arising from our Scottish Government's effective ban on fracking. Now, these little spiders live in lowland raised bogs, habitat which is crucial in tackling climate change. Unfortunately, raised bogs have declined by over 90% over the past 100 years, with the majority of bogland left damaged and in poor condition. Protecting our remaining peatlands is essential, however. Not only are they important for threatened wildlife, but they also store and regulate huge amounts of carbon and water, helping to reduce greenhouse emissions and prevent localised flooding. Now, the RSPB proposed a levy for peat use in horticulture around 8 years ago, and the UK Government published a white paper setting out its ambition for the horticultural sector to end its use of peat by 2030 through voluntary partnership. No levy has been forthcoming, unfortunately. However, the Scottish Government could act where the UK Government have ultimately failed and look into the possibilities of implementing a levy on horticultural peat use. A welcome development that would also be to look at new regulations to be put in place to label products containing peat which are sold in Scotland, and perhaps another positive step would be to look into stopping the use of peat by public bodies, including local authorities altogether. Scotland's peatlands are internationally important, yet despite this, peat extraction continues. I hope it stays on the government's radar over the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. Finlay Carson, followed by Gail Ross.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I thank Gillian Martin for bringing this debate to the Chamber, and I welcome the opportunity to speak in it, and delighted to follow on from Spider-Man. Now, you'll be aware that Robert Pattinson has been confirmed the new Batman, but you maybe don't know that I'm Scottish Parliament's very own Batman, as the Lesser Bat species champion. And I would like from the outset to say I haven't been bitten by a bat either, and I haven't brought my cape. But from the outset, I'd like to thank Liz Ferrell for her help in providing a briefing ahead of this debate, outlining how bats can enhance the natural environment and also the threats that they face. As a predator of common insects, bats can tell us a lot about the state of the environment, and they're also very sensitive to changes in land use. Because many of the pressures bats face, whether it's landscape changes, agricultural intensification, development, habitat fragmentation, and are also relevant to other wildlife species, making them an excellent indicator for the wider health of UK's wildlife. While bats can provide a valuable service for agriculture, some historical agricultural practices had a detrimental impact on bats. The use of pesticides meant bats suffered from the lack of insect prey. And the practice of removing hedgerows and woods in farmland is also concerning, as bats often rely on these features for roosting, hunting, and indeed the Lesser bat roosts not in roofs but in woodlands, and there's a large colony just up the road from my home in the Wood of Cree. It's welcome to see that the National Bat Monitoring Programme says that populations of bats are recovering and beginning to stabilise, although that hasn't always been the case, and we want to continue the pursuit of positive environmental legislation, and it's vital that this continues. That's why I'm backing calls from the Bat Conservation Trust to ask the Scottish Government to immediately take action to reverse biodiversity loss and clearly lay out what they hope to achieve post-2020. Because it's disappointing that at the moment we're seeing the government fail on targets in relation to habitat loss and control of invasive species and extinction of other species. The government needs to significantly increase their efforts ahead of 2020 and look already at measures that can be implemented to ensure biodiversity is not reduced. One way that could be achieved is to look into a national ecological network which would give practical, strategic and long-term way to invest in natural assets such as peatland and woodland, which can, as we know, store carbon. But it's not just bats who are affected by changes in the natural environment, and I wanted to touch on the fantastic work that the Galloway Fisheries Trust in my constituency have been doing to save the sparling in the River Cree. The sparling, or the cucumber fish, because they smell like cucumbers, were found in various Scottish rivers in the past, but died out mainly because of overfishing, pollution or barriers preventing them reaching their spawning grounds. Historically, records show that in the Cree alone, up to 6 tonnes were being caught, which equates to about 50,000 fish. And children would grab them out of the river and take them for their tea during their annual migration. But there's been a huge decrease, and in the River Cree is only now one of 3 rivers in Scotland where they're found. And the Galloway Fisheries Trust project was a 2-year scientific and educational initiative aimed at restoring these fish populations, and local schools have been involved as well as holding community events to help them reconnect the community with the sparling's heritage. The Lower Cree has been designated a site of special scientific interest to protect the rare fish, and hopeful that the population can be increased if it's successful. This is an important debate at a time when we're all looking to protect our environment, and I hope some of the points raised today can be taken forward positively.
Gail Ross, followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd also like to thank my colleague Gillian Martin for bringing this important debate to the Chamber today. I am the species champion for the red squirrel, but I'm proud to say that I'm also the very first species champion for seagrass. Seagrasses are flowering plants that have adapted over millions of years to life in the sea. The meadows that seagrasses form play an important role in keeping our oceans healthy and stocked with food. They provide a home for all kinds of marine life, including food fishes like juvenile cod and plaice, but also endangered species such as seahorses. Additionally, seagrasses also absorb large amounts of carbon dioxide from the surrounding seawater and have an important role to play in tackling the climate emergency. However, like so many species, seagrass has not been immune from global declines. Current research taking place at University College London provisionally estimates the current extent of UK seagrass to be a little over 8,500 hectares, down from around 76,000 hectares at the turn of the 20th century. That's an estimated loss of nearly 90% of our coastal seagrass meadows in just 100 years. And even if we take a cautious estimate from the data, it's abundantly clear that we have lost over 3/4 of our seagrass meadows, and with it the ecosystem services that seagrass meadows provide. Today, we are tackling both a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis that was started many generations ago and that has only increased in severity through the decades of intensified industrial production and global economic expansion. But it's clear that our response to these challenges are twofold. We need to consider what we can do now to stop further losses from current practices, and also what can be done to restore habitats degraded by what has happened in the past. Now, the good news is that over the last decade, increasing levels of understanding about the reproductive biology of seagrasses and their environmental requirements has led to vast improvements in the capacity of scientists to restore these meadows. In Scotland, we have 2 seagrass species, eelgrass and dwarf eelgrass, which have both suffered losses. The reintroduction into previous known sites provides significant opportunity to enhance recovery and support biodiversity. The UK is a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement that emphasises the critical importance of conserving seagrasses and other blue carbon ecosystems. And this is because seagrass meadows rapidly store organic carbon from within and external to the meadow into sediment that remains locked up and stable for very long time periods. Presiding Officer, I could go on, but I know that my time is limited and I will respect that today. But our seagrass meadows are very, very precious. Organisations like Project Seagrass is undertaking fantastic mapping and restorative work. And I would like to thank Dr. Richard Lilly and his team for all the hard work that they do, not just here, but all over the world. So if you're watching this, please help us to save our seagrass, join Project Seagrass, become a seagrass spotter, and ensure the survival of this vital part of our ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Ross. The last open debate speaker is Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much. Last month's UN report on biodiversity was clear that our global ecosystem faces a crisis on a par with the threat from climate change and that urgent action is required. That has implications for policymakers everywhere, including here in Scotland. I've been species champion for the curlew since 2013. The curlew is a barometer of biodiversity. It has suffered catastrophic decline in Ireland. It is now one of the most pressing conservation priorities for Scotland and across Britain, and I believe it is time to step up the actions taken in its defence. I want to highlight just 2 of the issues affecting the future of the curlew, for which Scottish Government ministers have a responsibility, and to ask if public policy priorities need to change in these areas. One is the issue of predator control in Strathbran. MSPs recently received an open letter from those involved in curlew conservation action in that area, and their conclusions should cause concern for us all. They argue that measures to control predation on breeding curlew by ravens are essential as part of a balanced programme of wader conservation, and that without such targeted conservation action, species such as the curlew will be lost. They call for the Scottish Government and Scottish Natural Heritage to press ahead with bold conservation measures this year in Strathbran and elsewhere. They say, if not, this may come to be seen as a defining moment when the battle to save the curlew was lost. I will, of course, be seeking a detailed response from ministers and SNH as species champion for the curlew, but I would welcome any comments that the Minister may wish to offer on that topic today. A second specific example I would mention is in Gillian Martin's own constituency, where Transport Scotland is considering rerouting the A96 away from Inverurie and building a new dual carriageway through farmland and through semi-natural habitats to the north and east of the town. That area contains what RSPB describe as moderate clusters of breeding curlew, which would be disrupted and potentially displaced if that option was selected for the A96 project. If we are serious about tackling the crisis in biodiversity, the breeding sites of endangered species need to be given the priority they deserve, and they need to be given that priority by transport and infrastructure ministers as well as environment ministers. There are, of course, good things going on, and we should celebrate those too. RSPB's trial curlew management project monitors breeding numbers, predator activity and habitats in key sites in Scotland and across Britain to establish what more should be done to protect the species. I know SNH has been supportive of such work in past years. I hope they will be again. I was lucky enough last month to visit the demonstration farm run by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust at Auchnerran near Tarland, which I know the Minister is familiar with, and to see how efforts to support one species bring benefits to others. So, for example, in that case, curlew and lapwing and oyster catchers all thrive in what is both an eco-friendly and a commercial agricultural environment. We need more such projects to support biodiversity. We need policymakers in government here and worldwide to be clear about priorities and to take decisions which will make a difference to species like the curlew for the sake of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. And I now call on Marie Gougeon to respond to the debate for 7 minutes. Please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll do my best to try and get around all the many points that were raised today, because, as ever, this is always such an interesting and enjoyable debate, and that's why I really want to thank Gillian Martin, because this debate I always look forward to either responding to or speaking in when I was in the government, because it's one of the highlights of the year, and not least because of all the weird and wonderful stories that it tends to bring to light. We discover that we have a number of superheroes across the chamber in Finlay Carson and Angus MacDonald. And yeah, like Gillian Martin and the tales of her goth days that she regaled us with last year in relation to the yew tree, today certainly didn't disappoint. So, but I think that when we look at the potential superhero powers that Gillian Martin has, I managed to do a quick search there of some of the powers she's got to look forward to. We might need a more catchier name than Seal Woman, but I think we've got some great powers and behaviours, such as, well, high intelligence, though of course Gillian Martin has that already, travelling, foraging, resting, mating, pupping, digesting, socialising and molting to look forward to. So there you go, Gillian. We also had a very interesting intervention about the sexual activity of slow worms from Bruce Crawford, while hearing about Keith Brown's sticky catchfly. And I think that brings us to a good point, because as much as the Species Champion initiative covers all sorts of species, it covers species on land and in sea, and whether they're plants or animals. And I think that when we look at plants, Shona Robison raised a very important point that plants underpin all life on Earth. And that's, again, why I think this initiative is so important in covering such a wide variety and diverse range of species. So I really want to thank everyone for their enjoyable contributions, which were, like I say, enjoyable, but also really got to the heart of some of the most serious issues that are facing us today. Because I think what we realise from listening to all the contributions today is what a very, very delicate balance that we have in our environment. And as Lewis MacDonald just talked about, we have those species which act as a barometer for biodiversity and to really gauge how our environment's doing, such as the curlew. And that's why I also want to thank Gillian Martin for the event that she held in Parliament last week with Scottish Environment Link on World Environment Day, because that really highlighted some of the major challenges we face, as well as how everyone across society can play a role in doing something about it. And not least, I think a lot of that fight has been really led by our young people too. We had the Sunnyside Ocean Defenders attend that event last week, who personally handed over to me their contributions to our consultation on environmental governance and principles proposals that we've put forward. And we also have the Ullapool Sea Savers as well. So I think that young people are really at the vanguard of some of the action that we're seeing at the moment. And I think it's important to remember, though, that Scotland isn't only taking action, we're leading the world with ambitious targets. Our recent amendments to the Climate Change Bill will aim to see net zero emissions by 2045, and if we achieve that, that means that within a generation, Scotland will no longer negatively contribute to climate change. Now, the recent global assessment of biodiversity highlights the serious impacts of biodiversity loss which is happening around the world, and that was a report that was mentioned by a number of members today. The report underlines the links between biodiversity loss and climate change, and members will have heard the First Minister say in response to a question from Claudia Beamish that biodiversity loss is as important as climate change. And as with climate change, we want Scotland to be at the forefront of addressing these issues. From the hard-working pollinators that sustain our ecosystems to our keystone species, we've taken action to address the climate emergency. Now, pollinators are a vital part of our biodiversity and wider environment. Many of our native wildflowers, shrubs and trees wouldn't be able to exist without them. Bees and hoverflies also provide the backbone for much of Scotland's agriculture and contribute around £43 million to the economy each year. In 2017, we set out a 10-year pollinator strategy for Scotland to make our country more pollinator-friendly and halt and reverse the decline in native pollinator populations. And when it comes to our species, our red squirrel population, as we heard a bit about, which is championed by Gil Ross, who, again, like others, is champion of land and sea, like Gillian Martin, with a few species to their name. Now, the red squirrel was seriously in decline due to their invasive non-native cousins, grey squirrels. However, thanks to the work of Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels project, red squirrels are now returning to some of the areas in Aberdeenshire and Tayside where they'd previously disappeared. However, as always, I think there is so much more that we need to do, and I know that question was asked by a number of members around the chamber today, particularly Claudia Beamish, Alison Johnson and Finlay Carson. When it comes to biodiversity and what we're looking to do there, we want Scotland to be the first country to carry out a thorough analysis of what we're already doing, where we need to do more, and also what we need to be doing differently. And by the end of 2019, we aim to have written to the Environment Committee with our initial assessment on that. As it was already mentioned, I think it was Alison Johnson who talked about this and where we are in relation to our biodiversity targets. So again, we're on track to achieve 7 out of 20 agreed by the international community in HE in 2010. Another 12 are progressing towards the target, but of course we need to be able to step up and do more if we want to meet that 2020 deadline. And that's where I think species champions have such a key role to play. It comes as no surprise that, of course, it's mentioned today as well, I'm the species champion for the hen harrier, and the Species Champion Initiative is one that I feel very passionate about, and clearly so do many others around this chamber. The Species Champion Initiative was relaunched in September 2016, and today 104 MSPs are now Species Champion, and that's 80% of the Parliament. But that's where I would also echo Claudia Beamish's call for the remaining 20% to join into that, because it's not too late to sign up. And I really want us to increase that number and get to 100% of MSPs. And just before I finish, I want to do my job as Species Champion and draw people's attention to the hen harrier. I represent a constituency where the hen harrier should be thriving, but it's not. And as we're all aware, deliberate and illegal persecution continues to threaten the very existence of raptors. We need to end that persecution, and there are a number of ongoing projects geared towards growing and sustaining raptor populations in Scotland. The Heads Up for Harriers project works with the states to identify, monitor and thereby protect hen harrier nests. And at the end of 2017, we set up an independent group to conduct an in-depth review of how grouse moor management can be made sustainable and compliant with the law. One of the key issues being examined there is raptor persecution, and led by Professor Werity of Dundee University, the group is due to report later in the summer. And we also have the Partnership for Action Against Wildlife Crime in Scotland, comprising a variety of organisations and sectors, including the police, shooting industry, science community and conservation groups, whose ultimate aim is to reduce raptor crime. But just to address Alexander Burnett's point as well, I chaired a meeting of that group yesterday where there is a subgroup on freshwater peril mussels and where they're considering all the issues there. However, with so many groups working together, unfortunately, harrier conservation efforts are continually let down, because in the last few months we've seen the disappearances of hen harriers, Marcy and Skylar. But as a government, we are committed to doing more and doing all we can to end this persecution. So just to bring that to a close, close, I think it's fantastic that we have a focus today on the wonderful diversity of species that we have in Scotland, and to hear the enthusiasm and commitment of those in Chamber. Again, it's also raised awareness of some of the serious issues that we face in Scotland, but this is something that the Scottish Government takes very seriously, and we are taking action to act on this and to prevent any further biodiversity loss. And I hope that the debates prompted us all to consider what further action we need to take, both to protect our native species and enhance biodiversity right across Scotland. Thank you very much.
That concludes the debate, and this meeting is suspended until 2 o'clock.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today, and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK Government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women, and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.